Van Wyck Brooks was a writer and critic who, quote, exhorted writers to meet their responsibility with courage and dignity and with pride. In 1918, he called for the creation of what he called a usable past. Speaking to his contemporaries, he outlined the need for history that creative minds could draw upon. Quote, the present is a void, he wrote, and the American writer floats in that void because the past that survives in the common mind of the present is a past without living value. The gray conventional mind casts its shadow backward, Brooks observed, but why should not the creative mind dispel that shadow with shafts of light? Now that's from Lizzie O'Shea's book, not only Lizzie O'Shea, but very, very similar to something that Kaneko Toto was saying in 1947, and that's pretty interesting. And so this idea, I just want to start off with this idea of a usable past, and as we're losing the past very quickly, there is something important that we're losing that's hard to see. It's very hard to see what's missing. Right? So I think as haiku poets, we're ahead of the curve. We're needed, but it's not known that we're needed yet. But I think we're going to be more needed than ever in the future. Something to think about. At least I believe it. The question of a usable past was at the forefront of a group of Japanese avant-garde poets by 1947, when just after war defeat, the question arose, should we continue to compose haiku? It took insight and grit to determine that under a new set of foundational elements, the answer could be yes. Primary to their decision not to abandon the centuries-old form, which had been so recently been used to urge a militarist, fascist holy war haiku, praising xenophobic views of Japaneseness, had been a common sight in newspapers. These are radical ideas. So this was almost really happened. There was a lot of abandonment of these traditional ideas of quote-unquote Japaneseness, which had just destroyed the spirit of the people and the country, and also everyone was starving then too in Japan, and all the cities were burned. And not to mention the atomic bombs. So, why haiku when you think about it? I mean, what was left of it that was worth continuing? What were you saying by writing haiku? Isn't that just a furtherance of some kind of militarist nationalist idea, right? So, Kaneko Toto was at the forefront of this group of people who had come out of the war, but somehow feeling that there's something that's so very important in haiku. What is it, and what could we do with it that's worth doing to say something to the post-war world, right? And this is the concept of the author's stance. It's coming out of this kind of thinking. And so there are two concepts I'm going to talk about. One is called Taido, stance, and the other is shiso, which doesn't translate well into English, but I translate it as an embodied personal philosophy, a living ideology. Living is very important. And these translations were occurring in real time in discussions with Kaneko himself. We didn't make them up later. And here's something from the interview. Kaneko stated, quote, if I could expand on this idea of shiso, he says, a person who has not absorbed and integrated an ideology into their daily life cannot be trusted. I cannot trust a person who lacks a living ideology. That's why I don't have any faith in terms such as communism, socialism, and the like, especially words that have an ism attached to them. So what he's talking about is not ideology in that sense. He's talking about something else. But as with a lot of Kaneko's criticism, he kind of leaves it up to us to actually know what that is inside ourselves. Like, he's not going to say, oh, I know what your shiso is, I know what your embodiment is. He's not going to tell you. But he's saying, you got to fight for that. You have to, what is your stance? Do you have it? It's sort of like we would say, what are your ethics? Or, where do you get your poetry from that has meaning for other people? He's talking about some very, very gritty things. And this is what they were doing to revive or reform or recreate haiku in this post-war era. And so what I'd like to say about this is that developing shiso, an embodied personal philosophy, has to do with being an authentic human being. Right? It's authenticity. But it's more than that. There's another side of it where, in order to be an artist, coming from that embodied ideology or embodied philosophy, it involves something that I'll show you in a minute, Werner Herzog talks about, which is courage, vision, and bravery. And I just think there are words we don't hear enough, and I feel that a lot of haiku are brave, they're courageous, they're raw, they're immediate, and we feel that there's truth in them, and that's the authenticity. And this is part of what Kaneko Tota was talking about back in from the late 40s. So, and I think it's still exactly true today. It's not a dated idea. So let me now move on. So bravery and authenticity is the theme. And Dr. Cornel West, I'll just read it from the screen there. The blue is sort of I highlighted there, so we didn't have to go through the whole thing, but he says, basically, most of our lives you see we're dealing with a whole history of the species, of structures of domination, oppression. That's the history of the species for the most part, and there's moments in which breakthroughs, in which there's this freedom of spirit arises. I mean, Dostoevsky's right, most people are really afraid of freedom. And I think that was an interesting thing to say. Okay, and here's Werner Herzog. And Eric Weinstein interviewed him. Now in our time, there's this mania for truth and authenticity, for acknowledging that it's always the group and never the individual that matters. The so-called great man theory of history is certainly at its cultural low, and yet here you are. And Herzog answers, these days in Hollywood, things are determined by boardroom decisions, and that's why movie making has become so stale and so uninteresting and so predictable. It has to do with the caliber of your quest, with the depth of your story, with the vision that you're pursuing. If that has real depth, then you know it has enduring depth. Then you have the task and the duty to do things that are necessary. As long as I said, as you do not damage or hurt anyone. I think these two people are saying something very similar to Kaneko Tota, and they're talking about stance, taking a stance. And they're also talking about confronting fear, like the fear of freedom, which is actually a fear, or sticking with a vision, or sticking with the depth of what is your, say, inner calling. So in terms of Kaneko Tota, this is the book that just came out. There's a picture of Kaneko Tota as a soldier, I think, and he was a U.S. naval accountant. And there he is. It was actually a pretty recent photo. So a stance is a committed, embodied viewpoint, bearing, or attitude. The poet has evolved through self-effort to something of value, to having something of value to say to society, a position from which you can critique society intelligently. And my little beaner is not working. New batteries. They are new batteries, I guess. Okay. And there's the term shiso, personal sense of philosophical organization, or a living ideology necessary for a poet to achieve a stance in life. So these two things are connected. And another term that comes from Kaneko Tota that I'll show later is ikimono, which means living beings or living things, but it's also related to immediacy and rawness in poetry and in life. And this is my book from 2018, Poetry is Consciousness. And down there is Don Barton and myself. I'm looking really happy because he made me an honorary black belt in his school. And I'll tell you this story, the funny story. It was, I guess it liked me and everything, but it was, so he had a beautiful Mercedes-Benz sports car, and he lives pretty far away from his dojo, and he's driving back and forth to his house, and then he had stopped to get gas, and just for some reason, it was dusk, and he's a driver. And I get out of the car, and I run out of the car, and it was a self-service, and I grabbed some towels and I cleaned up its headlights, really shined them up. And later he said, the way you did that, that's why you're getting it. It's a pretty cool thing. Something might happen there. And so I'd like to talk about creating worlds as one of, these are some of my own not my own stance, but maybe it is kind of like my own, it has to do with my own search for shiso. And so, in other words, Kaneko Tota's ideas really have affected me a lot and have given me to think a lot and contemplate. And I have this position that any haiku creates a unique world, and that we create worlds all the time, and they're complete worlds in some way. And they cohere, and they're very interesting worlds, but it's very hard to describe what that world is. At the same time, because it creates a world and that world has value, therefore it's also philosophical. It's not just a fanciful fantasy of someone's imagination. There's a philosophical, epistemological, and ontological sense to it, if you want to get academic about it. And I determined this word that Charlie Trumbull might grumble about, I'm not sure, but philopoetics is a coinage of mine, because I feel like that's the way I want to talk about this idea that haiku are deeply philosophical, but in a poetic way. So we can't determine, oh, it's this kind of philosophy or that kind of philosophy. It's poetry, but we don't talk about the philosophy enough. And I think to have a stance, to have something to say to society, I think you have to have a ground, a foundation, and I think that's the philosophical part, which is to say, like the Greek nous, a reason. There's a reason deeply within, a nous, that gives us existence, that gives us truth. And it's that aspect which is philosophical. Sorry, a little long-winded. And then I also like to talk about architectures of language, and that was in a book I did in 2013, Disjunctive Dragonfly, or as my friend Jim Casey says, distinctive butterfly. We're joking about it. A lot of people, it's his poem, that started that off. Great poem, which I don't remember. I'm very bad at remembering poems. But the 24 techniques of disjunction have to do with using language play to create worlds. And so I haven't started my talk yet. And the beginning of my talk is this, which is at the fourth. See, I told you, it's trouble. So I'm going to talk, so stanzas we already talked about, but there's actually six I can determine that. There's also 5 blooms, which I'd like to, our theme of the conference is creative diversity. And so I want to show you 5 different types of creative diversity with poetry. Then I'd like to show you 6 forests, which are dimensions of literary criticism. They're actually pretty nice, but we'll probably not get to them. And then something that got started maybe a week ago called the Haiku Sanctuary. This is an international forum, haikusanctuary.com. Check it out. Hopefully it will be growing. So what do we have here? So stance. I think that thinking about a stance or asking the question, what is a stance, already is a stance. Like that's already something. So I stuck it in there as one. And then of course this idea of embodied living ideology, that's another aspect of stance or of developing one. But then there's a deeper one, which is kind of where's the poem in your mind? What's the isness of the work that you feel? And I call that philopoetics. I think that kind of feeling or question of, it doesn't really have an answer, but it's a questioning. And then we have incarnation, which is, has to do with imagination and bringing words into being, bringing images into being. I think that's making the embodied part embodied. And then we have an aspect of deepening and permeability, allowing oneself to be permeable to all sorts of input. Dreams, psychological ideas, things that happen in your day. And Kaneko has a term for this too, which intellectual wildness is his term actually, that he talks about in the book. Has to do with drunken kukai, but it's another story. It's a really good story. Yeah, you'd like it. And then finally, another aspect of stance is through form, psyche informs. And I have this thing, autonomy, becoming autonomous as an artist, or in my sense of how I think of it, is that I think that the poem becomes more real in you in a certain way. That world that is created is something really deep and true, and then you get something from that. And in Greek, it's aesthesis, which is the world speaks back to you. You know, the world comes back to you in these ways, and the poem comes back to you and changes you. And that's through form, psyche, informs. So it's this idea of the death psychology, really. Okay, so that wasn't hard enough to deal with. I'd like to talk about, or show, 5 kinds of creative diversity. So I think some haiku that are interesting have this aspect of distance from others and closeness to self. It's just an interesting thing. Another is poetry and protection. Another aspect is poetry and sacredness or sanctity. And then another has to do with risk, sanctuary, place, and challenge. And another one here is, this is ma, which kind of means psychological in-betweenness. The feeling of haiku when it's just this really cool, in-between psychological, mysterious quality that is delightful, but kind of hard to get your head around. Now, in the literary criticism side, these are things we don't talk about, and that's why I put them in here, because I feel like that if we're going to develop a literary criticism of haiku, or just let's scrap postmodernism right off. I mean, you know, let's just scratch that out and start with something. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, start with something interesting. You know, what's interesting to talk about? If we're not just going to talk about like this haiku is good, but talk about like what's in it for you. Like to me, one thing is we don't talk enough about haiku spirit, and I don't mean religion or spirituality. I mean just the sense of sacred intention and expression. Just generally, more talk about that would be interesting. And then another area is creating worlds or alternativity, sci-fi, futurism, fantasy. There are a lot of haiku that are doing that. Another would be this from Kaneko is living things, rawness and immediacy. Are ikimono. This idea is a very interesting one. I'll show you some examples, and some of them are people to like. They're pretty raw. And okay, and another shakaisei. This is a term from again the Japanese group, but it's haiku that have a direct concern with social consciousness or social awareness. It doesn't mean propagandistic, but you know when you write it, there are a number of people here who have written poems about the atomic bomb, for instance, or Nagasaki, you know, and like that. So. You name it. This is an area of poetry that in haiku that are powerful often. And then language again. And what's beyond haiku? Where are we going? You know, what's that edge between haiku and the short form poem? And exploring that and allowing ourselves to stretch even beyond renku or serial haiku or whatever. And I think, you know, Philip Roland has been doing this in his Noon Journal and now Anthology for years now. But, you know, I think that we could include more of that within the haiku frame. And then as a kind of ground in the real world of action would be the Haiku Sanctuary as it's an online forum, and there's a vision, a mission, a staff, use of digital tech. And it has to do with ideas of anarchic sanctuary, which come from my book from last year, and creative community. I'm real concerned about that, like how to develop that as a group, as a community. Anarchic is in a positive sense of non-hierarchical and free, as an artist cooperative is what I'm talking about. And then, you know, having interactivity. And we don't have a lot of interactivity. Here is interactivity. We're physical beings in a real place for a short time, but you know, journals don't have a lot of feedback, and even online journals don't, you know, it's just really hard to have conversations, I think, especially when we're all around the world. So that's part of why the forum is there. And this is just a little idea about international haiku community where, well, I'll just show you the pictures. So on this side, you know, developing a stance and the idea of developing diversity in your own work, those are personal things. The world enters self in a sense, and it's private. You know, we write in isolation. That's, you know, we need non-distractive time, and you know, you don't want your phone bothering you all the time and all that. But then on the other side, you know, you have these dimensions of literary criticism, meaning where you just talking about ideas and sharing ideas, and in this case, having a sanctuary idea. So. Okay, now that's not supposed to do that. No, it's really not. Stop. All right, so. Okay, so what this is. All right, so I kind of made this into a process where you can also look at this this idea of developing a stance as a process, and now it's working. So just looking at the orange things, investigation, articulation, philopoetic design, meaning the world in mind, then incarnation, inviting imagination, and then being seen, deepening through form. Intimacy is a key word of this, allowing that rawness or vulnerability, and finally this idea of, as Simone Weil said, in distance is the soul of beauty. It's one of my favorite things. Each poem becomes a focus, a lens, a novel cosmetics or display image of cosmos. I think that's part of the power of the poem. So there's something to chew on. That's why I should have been chewing on that. Now this stuff I'm going to skip over because it's too long. But I actually had these quotes from Kaneko about each one of these things. And I just think, I already said what they are. And I'm going to go over them quickly, like really quickly. But you see, there's a lot of, there's text. I mean, there's stuff that you can read in the books mentioned in that really talk quite a bit about it, especially this one on incarnation, being seen and deepening. There's a lot in my book on that, and this is and also psyche importance. Okay, so there's that. That's done. But the pictures are nice. That's from Sabine Miller, and that's from NASA. And this one's nice, actually. Attendance and trust. We see and are seen in imagination. This is an intimacy of seeing that occurs whenever we are jolted, moved, or surprised by what shifts us out of habitual frames of concept and perception within the space of thought. Another way to say this is that the ego is de-literalized via imaginative experiences. Worlds of imagination arise spontaneously and autonomously. Poems reconstruct being, hover and flit through the under and overground of consciousness. Each poem becomes a focus, a lens, a novel cosmetics of cosmos, psyche in forms. And that's from my book last year. Okay, so this you saw before, and I'm showing this again because I keep forgetting it. And I thought it was good to see it. So there it is again. And these are these 6, almost you could see it as a staged process of investigation, articulation, philopoetic design, incarnation, being seen, and psyche. Okay. But the thing about this all is that, from Sabine, just because you have a stance, like what's the connection between the author's stance and the poem? And the answer is that there is no connection. If I could read poems and say, oh, the author's stance is this or that, that would be a false ideology. I mean, as a reader, I don't know what the author's stance is. That's their business, But I have mine. And so, there could be a felt connection. I mean, I could feel something from that person. We say, like this author has a voice. I think we heard about, Peggy Lyles, and she has a voice. You feel that voice, and maybe that has to do with this stance in some way, But it's a felt connection. But then, as an editor, I have a stance, and I make my selections, and that might really reveal some things about my stance. So that's a different matter. And now talking about creative diversity. So let's look at some poems. And what I'd like to say here, see, it says author stance meets reader stance, editorial intention. Well, this is all on me. So the things I'm going to show you, if you really disagree, you have every right to, because it's kind of I chose these things, and it's unfair. But it's based on my stance, and I'm going to stand up for it. I'll try to defend that if I can. So, and I love these poems. I don't choose things I don't love. So, just please, how to forgive spring rain, dense fog, I dream walk, my sense of I, spring dawn, I put on my gender. I'm sure some of you know all the authors, so let's see who they are. Michelle Tennyson, Kala Ramesh, and David Lynch, who is just stand up, I think. These are great haiku. So Distance from others, closeness to self. So there's a sense there for me in these haiku. Another set. So poetry and protection, even if because plum blossoms in the courtyard. Midnight Mockingbird, Allen Ginsberg in my bed. Just enough of rain to bring the smell of silk from umbrellas. Okay, wait, don't start it. Don't. So Miriam Sagan, Cathabella Wilson, and Richard Wright. So poetry and protection. You sense that. Interesting play there. So another aspect of creative diversity. This one is poetry and sacredness or sanctity. Pig and I, spring rain. Hiding in everything, plain sight. The river makes of the moon. So that's Marlene Mountain, Don Wentworth, and Jim Casey. And this is number 4, risk. So looking at risk, sanctuary, place, and challenge. Bomb nor embody to take blue sky. Ants begin to look like an idea. So greenly, history puts forth thorns. Mark Harris, Scott Metz, and Eve Lukring. So, the idea of risk is, for instance, in the second one is, to me, there's a risk there of psychosis. I mean, there are different kinds of risk. And to me, I thought, that's a little edgy, but I think we've all had that experience of the swarm, this strange feeling of, that there's something there that's, maybe I'm going crazy or the world is crazy. And this is a 5th one here. So, the idea of ma, or the betweenness of words and consciousness in haiku. First light, not enough words for green. If, I think I did this wrong. Is it if a glass? Oh shoot. I think it's if glass breaks easily, a bird. That is right. If glass breaks easily, a bird. Body bag, not asking, not telling. And these are by Susan Constable, John Stevenson. Is John here?
Yes.
Did I misquote you?
No, you got it correctly.
Is there an "ah"?
No.
It's correct?
That's correct.
Good, okay. It's awesome. I love this haiku, so thank you. And Jerry Kilbride. I'm going to introduce Haiku Sanctuary just quickly. This is the forum that we just started. Myself, Clayton Beach, Hansha Teki, otherwise known as Stephen Bailey from New Zealand, and Don Barrett, who's in Burbank, California. The foundation members are Victor Ortiz, Sabine Miller, and Michelle Tennyson. And they were all editors that helped me with my book last year. And if you I don't have any cards or anything, but it's just haikusanctuary.com, and I invite you to visit there and register if you feel like you'd like to. One of the sections is what I'm talking about in the literary criticism dimension. So we have all those areas as just part of the site. There's also workshops, a gallery, a lot of other things, but this talk is connected with the work that's going on online. Then we can go back to this little design here. Let me do this again quickly. And just pointing out this idea of intrapersonal versus interpersonal. And I'll fill these in quickly. These are the same things that you saw before, so we don't need to spend time there. Now I did want to, with some of the remaining minutes, I had some quotes. This would actually be the kind of thing that might be a thread on the forum, which would be you would have like an example post, like this is from, I'll just put the whole thing on here, from David Lynch, the famous filmmaker, who said people nowadays are suffering from all kinds of negativity, primarily stress, and a lot of people are suffering from traumatic stress. Negativity, stress, and anxieties, tension, anger, fear, all these things squeeze the tube through which ideas flow. Negativity is the enemy to creativity, but what are we going to do about it? People have to know that within every human being is a treasury, and this treasury is an unbounded ocean of pure consciousness. So within us all is unbounded intelligence, creativity, happiness, love, energy, power, and peace. If we could contact that ocean, experience it, negativity naturally, effortlessly lifts away. Turn the awareness from out, 180 degrees to within, within, and once we're pointed within, we will naturally and easily dive through subtler levels of mind and then subtler levels of intellect, and at the border of intellect will transcend, will experience that big ocean, the treasury. Now, it doesn't matter to me whether this is true or not. I just know his creative work, and I respect that this is his stance. You know, this is what I'm interesting, that in terms of haiku spirit, it doesn't have to be something from the haiku world at all that we're looking at. And then we can also go a step further, and you can find haiku that seem to relate to that in some way, and that's kind of what I did. So, lotus into pond, into lotus. From being a seed to being a seed, each one wheat in the wind of the other. And that's Agnes Eva Savage, Ashish Narayan, I'm going to spell his name right, and Danny Blackwell. I've taken all these from Bone 17 because it's just the latest. I just went to the latest journal online that I could find, so anyone can find this, Bone 17. Now I'm not going to go through these example posts because it'll take too long. But in the terms of creating worlds and alternativity, I'm just going to skip right through it. We had another quote from the owner-builder of the Shangri-La recording studios, very interesting man. And let's get to some of the creating worlds haiku here. I don't want to go too fast. Where angels are, less snow. Ghost moon ferryman, knowing will pay. Empty nest, lifting a cricket to her lips. So when you think of how to haiku create a world, I think the only way is when you look at the haiku, it's where angels are, less snow. There's so few words, there's so few images, and yet to me there's just a whole world created there, and equally for all of these, but in very, very different ways. Elmedin Kadrik, Helen Buckingham, and Lee Gerga. Lee, did I get your haiku right? Okay, thanks. I'm glad for that. And these are in Bone 17. And this is Ikimono. You'll like this one. This is one of my favorites. This is from Kaneko Tota. I think I'll read this one, but I think I have enough time. Now, he uses this word arai, which means wildness or roughness. I take arai, wildness, as freedom. On arai, which I mentioned in the other lecture, a life moves by instinct. To put this another way, a life moves by stretching out tentacles of instinct. This movement could be called freedom. It's nama, a raw thing. And I'll just stop there because let's look at some of these poems. Rawness and immediacy, Ikimono. A wild boar comes, eats air, spring mountain path. A wild boar comes, eats air, spring mountain path. Oh, pig, we saw that one again, pig and I, spring rain. My mother delivered me as if I were a shit. And the first and last are Kaneko Tota's haiku. And now the last one, you may love it and you may hate it. Usually you don't get a tepid response from my mother delivering me as if I were a shit. And I'll tell you, in Japan, people don't really have swear words, or you don't hear them except in yakuza movies, right? So, you know, to use this word in a haiku, I mean, someone of the stature of Kaneko Tota can do it. We had this interesting discussion about if you were to use a word that was a pretty strong word, you know, would an editor really let that go and put, you know, would they put that in their journal? I think probably not, actually, unless you were had some stature. But anyway, you know, Kaneko got some shit for this one, and he commented on it in the interview, and his comment was typical, a very funny one, and kind of clever. And let's see if I got it here. He said, this is what he said directly translated: shit, excrement, born as if a shit. She delivered us as if a shit. The midwife who delivered children for my mother said as much when I was born. Oksan, mother, you're strong and healthy, you birthed this baby just like taking a shit. From that point on, she would say we kids all look like shits. I had to listen to that. You know, we all crack up. So, and then he says, isn't that good? Yes, raw, very raw. Because it's so completely raw, people either love or hate that haiku. Abe Kanichi, who I think was a kind of genius as a poet and haijin, he was a doctor, really prized this haiku of mine. He said tears would come to his eyes when he talked about this haiku. You know, so rawness and immediacy, you know, it's not a light thing really. You know, you really feel it when Kaneko writes a poem like that and then puts it in his interview with us, and we're communicating in English. This is one of the two he chose on this topic. So, and these are social consciousness haiku. Again, I'm not going to go in with the post, but it's online actually. These are all online in the forum. You can read this later if you want to go there. And there's 6 of these groups. So let's go and check these out quickly. $18,000 sex box expose, my fetish to cook with one. Well, it's interesting, on the theme of social consciousness, I think that's pretty cool. Because no name is still a name when said out loud. Where angels are, I mean, not that one, I'm sorry, I kind of mixed up these a bit, but you're getting the idea, so I got to fix this up. All things being equal, vulture. And Samar Gose, Ashish Narayan, I'm with Kadrik and Lauren Stacy from Bowen 17. And let's move to architecture. Now this will be using language deformation, language techniques of different kinds, so playing with language to create a world, to create a kind of philosophical idea. I'm not going to. This is from Disjunctive Dragonfly, this particular stuff on this slide, but the poems are new, I think. Wet, cold war dream, fall leaves them where they. Wet, cold war dream, fall leaves them where they. Murder. Murder. And whale song, the precipice in a leaf. Melissa Allen, Roland Packer, and Sherry Hunter Day from Islet, from Scott Mepps. These are all written, as you see, April 9, May 19, and January 20 this year. And finally, Beyond the Horizon. Now, I took these from Noon, an anthology of short poems. Phil Rowland couldn't be here. He lives in Tokyo. He came to Winston-Salem with us in 2007. He was here. It was really great that he was here. And he's just put together this anthology, all the Noons, and he selected out. And I have a few. So I'm not going to, this is a quote from his introduction. I'm not going to read because we don't have time. But some of the poems that are in there. First one, Sonnet for Philip Glass, Jim Casian, age 107, looks like this. Jim, can you read it?
Sure. Storm, 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 store, 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 stone, 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 scone, 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 scone. Scene, 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 scent, 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 scent. Scent, 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 slant, scant, 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 slant, 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 plant, 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 plank, 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 prank. Prank, 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 drank, 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 drang, drung, 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 wrong, 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 throng, throng.
Thank you.
Is that 17 syllables?
And I have just a couple more. They're not as long as that one, or as repetitiously interesting as it's Phil Glass. It's great because of the connection there. And so we have this poem: pulling one bindweed root, circumnavigate your world. It's a poem. Another poem is supermarket veteran pretends to shoot my daughter smiling. John Marcone and Scott Metz. And last one, let's see, pop this out. Into the field beyond the street lamps to let the moon rise in the throat. And that's a couple more. Turn there is only the hummingbird's was. A delta of refrains, sun scrubs solve. You who speak of clarity. David Berridge, Peter Yogu, and Eve Lukery. And I think that's the end of my time. Well, no, I've got 3 more minutes. Thank you for listening.